Hello, I'm Oliver Colling, and this is my 70s TV childhood. Welcome back to the podcast which is all about growing up in 1970s Britain and the important part that television played in all of our lives back then. We are part memoir, part social history, and part just good old nostalgia, looking back to a simpler time when those of us of a certain age enjoyed our childhoods, despite the UK being in economic crisis and all of us having to wear green, brown and beige clothes all the time. Now, exciting news. At the time of this recording, this episode is due to be released on the 22nd of October 2024, and on the 23rd of October, we will be attending the star-studded, glitzy UK Independent Podcast Awards ceremony, where, for the second successive year, we have been shortlisted for Best TV and Film Podcast. Wish us luck, and we'll keep you posted on how we get on. But of course, the only reason we are in line for awards is because of you, our wonderful listeners. Without your engagement, your memories, and the great support you give to us, there wouldn't be a podcast. I never cease to be amazed at how many of you take the time to get in touch and share your memories, put me right on some of the factual errors I make, and generally let us know how the podcast ignites happy memories for you, some of which have remained forgotten for decades. Following our recent episode featuring The Good Life, lots of you have been in touch to say how much you enjoyed being taken back to Tom and Barbara Good's Surbiton home, where they were, well, frankly, way ahead of their time in looking to be self-sufficient. Guy got in touch via our Facebook page to tell us he had an allotment years ago with chickens, ducks and goats, one being called Geraldine, like in the show. And after growing peas, he had a go at making pea pod wine. As soon as it was ready, he drank a sip, and in Guy's words, it was bloody awful. Thankfully, Guy bottled it, left it for about a year and tried it. And it wasn't that bad at all. Thanks for sharing that, Guy. Are you sure you're not Tom Good in disguise? We also heard from Helen, one of our regular listeners, who confessed that her parents secretly allowed her to get up to watch the show after she and her younger sister had been sent to bed. What a lovely memory, Helen. I hope your sister isn't listening and finds out the truth after all of these years. But thanks for sharing that. Oh, and we had an awful lot of listeners who have, or still appear to have, long-held crushes on Felicity Kendall as Barbara. And some who had a thing about Penelope Keith as Margot as well. Look, calm down, everybody. If you'd like to get in touch, like many other listeners have done so, you can do so in a number of ways. You can leave a message on our blog at www.my70stvchildhood.com or on one of our many social media sites. Or if you prefer, just email me, oliver@my70stvchildhood.com. We would love to hear from you. One thing I do find really interesting is that certain shows come up in the messages I get from listeners again and again. And we're going to remember one of those for the rest of this episode. This is a show which only had one series, but lives on in many of your memories quite vividly. Now, regular viewers will know that I do tread very carefully when it comes to science fiction, because many of you hold certain shows very dearly, and I'm conscious that I don't want to upset any of you who hold these programmes in such high regard. In past episodes, we've covered the likes of The Tomorrow People, Survivors, and Doctor Who. In fact, I will recommend our Doctor Who 60th birthday special if you haven't heard it, as we had lots of fun working with several Doctor Who podcast hosts who are far more knowledgeable on this subject than I am. We also have plans to cover shows like Blake 7 and Star Trek in future episodes. But the show which is mentioned as much as virtually any other sci-fi programme by you is one from 1970, featuring two teenagers who find themselves unwittingly travelling through time and space in what was a really quite challenging, frequently scary, and extremely disturbing series of adventures over 26 episodes. Timeslip was broadcast in 1970 to great critical and popular acclaim. Now, I remember parts of the show vividly, but I couldn't have been watching it in 1970 as I was only 3 years old at the time. It was repeated about 1973, so I must have watched it then. And, like many dramas supposedly aimed at children at the time, I remember it being quite grown up in its themes. It also, to my 6 or 7-year-old self, exuded threat and menace. Now, there is a theme here. As many regular listeners will know, everywhere, whether it was in public information films or on TV dramas like this and others like Children of the Stones, the whole of broadcast media, I think, was trying to scare the hell out of our generation of kids. And I think we loved it, to be honest. So what exactly was Timeslip? For those of you who might not know or don't remember the show, it was an ITV show that aired in 1970 and, as I said, ran for just one season of 26 episodes. But it made a lasting impact on fans of time travel and, well, what should we call it, speculative fiction. The series was aimed primarily at children, but, as we'll see, it took on some surprisingly mature and thought-provoking themes for the time. The basic premise revolves around two teenagers, Simon Randall, played by Spencer Banks, and Liz Skinner, played by Cheryl Burfield, who discover a time barrier that allows them to slip through time. Pretty cool, eh? But it's not your typical time machine scenario like Doctor Who. Oh no. Instead, the two children enter different historical and future settings where they encounter all sorts of things, from war zones to dystopian laboratories. What's really interesting, though, is that each time period they visit is deeply connected to their own personal stories and to each other. I guess it's as much of a journey of personal discovery as it is a journey through time. In an interview in 2020, marking the 50th anniversary of the show, Cheryl Burfield and Spencer Banks, who incidentally remain firm friends to this day, tried to explain what the show was all about.
Timeslip is a science fiction series. It incorporates time travel. It had a lot of scientific-based, futuristic possibilities of what our world might turn into in the future.
It told the story of two teenagers thrown together more by accident than design.
And the appeal is because it was a real adventure story as well, and there was always a cliffhanger, so it was very exciting.
I do remember often being irritated by Simon, who was a bit of a goody-goody and quite a know-it-all from what I remember. Whereas I remember Liz being a bit more practical and sensible. Although probably driven by gender attitudes of the time, Liz was partial to a bit of hysteria and emotion at the dark forces that the couple came up against. They were also separated by a few years in age. Simon was meant to be 13 or 14, I think, although the actor was a young-looking 16. And Liz was meant to be 16, although Cheryl Burfield, I think, was about 20 when the series was shot. What sets the characterisation apart is that these two teenagers aren't just passive observers, they're active participants in the time periods they visit, and their growth is a key part of the show. Simon, as well as being incredibly irritating, is the more pragmatic and sceptical of the two, whereas Liz is more intuitive and empathetic, and that sort of dynamic evolves as the series progresses. One thing that really stands out about the performances is how natural and relatable the children are. They're not portrayed as overly heroic or all-knowing. They're flawed. They're scared at times. They don't always make the right choices, which makes them feel very real. And I think this helped the audience, especially younger viewers like me, connect with them. And maybe that's one of the main reasons why the show has lived on so strongly in our memories. That, and also the interesting and quite different plot lines which ran through the series. Before we dive deeper into the plot and the themes, let's take a quick trip back to 1970 to understand how the show came about. Timeslip was the brainchild of Bruce Stewart and produced by ATV, run by the great Lou Grade, which serviced the Midlands ITV franchise at the time. Stewart wasn't very well known, let alone a household name, but he had a knack for combining speculative fiction with more grounded human stories. At the time, the BBC was already becoming a global powerhouse in sci-fi productions, thanks in large part to the success of Doctor Who. But Timeslip was a bit different. It was conceived as a children's series, but with the ambition to tackle ideas like the ethics of scientific experimentation, the impact of technology on society, and even the Cold War. It wasn't content with just being a romp through time. It wanted to ask some pretty tough questions too, and we'll get into some of those in a little while. So back to the plot. Timeslip is divided into 4 distinct stories, each exploring different time periods and themes. And what makes this show so interesting is not just about visiting the past or visiting the future in a simple way. Each part plays into the larger mystery of what's actually going on behind the time barrier itself. The first storyline, The Wrong End of Time, is set during World War II. Simon and Liz tumble upon the time barrier, which is hidden in a fence at a rather spooky, disused Ministry of Defence camp. It also has very low-budget special effects, when they fall through into the past and find themselves in 1940 at the same military research base, where they uncover secret experiments involving time travel. This immediately sets the tone for the show, blending real-world historical events with science fiction elements. It is also yet another example of TV's obsession with Nazis in the 1970s. What I didn't realise as a child, watching so many shows where Nazis popped up as villains, or where Hitler wasn't actually dead but hidden in a big freezer, or living a quiet life in South America, was that the war was still very real and fresh in people's memories. 1970 was only 25 years after 1945, so I'm guessing the equivalent for us in 2024 would be 1999, which only seems like yesterday to me. So far, so good. We can just about handle Nazis and time travel. But the second storyline, The Time of the Icebox, is where things started getting, well, a bit weird. Simon and Liz travel to a dystopian future, aren't they all? Where scientists are conducting human experiments. The storyline really dives into the ethics of science and the dangers of letting technology and cold logic override humanity and decency. All a bit heavy for tea time children's TV, but none the worse for it. Next, in the year of the burn-up, they visit a version of the future where climate change has run rampant and Earth is on the brink of environmental collapse. This was in 1970, don't forget, long before climate change was a widespread concern. It was pretty forward-thinking to have a kids' show tackling this issue. And finally, the last part of the series, the storyline The Day of the Clone, brings the characters back to the present day, but with a twist. The story focuses on cloning and the manipulation of identity, wrapping up the show's ongoing mystery about time travel and the time barrier. I seem to remember the various versions of the main characters, including older versions of Simon and Liz. So it was all a bit complex, and I'm sure I didn't have a clue what was going on really, age 7. One of the most interesting things about Timeslip is how it used its time travel premise to explore complex themes, especially for a tea time children's show. There's the idea of scientific ethics. In almost every part of their adventures, the characters encounter scientists who are pushing the boundaries of what's morally acceptable in the name of progress. Whether it's, as I mentioned earlier, experimenting on humans or meddling with the natural world. The show was definitely ahead of its time in questioning the wisdom of our unchecked scientific exploration. And, that's still a hot topic of discussion for our society today. Then there's the theme of environmental collapse in the year of the burn-up. These episodes really stand out in retrospect. Climate change wasn't a widely understood issue in 1970, yet this show had a futuristic world where nature was destroyed and humanity was suffering the consequences. It's hard not to think of the parallels to today's concerns and arguments about global warming. And then there's the Cold War subtext that runs through many of the storylines. Britain of the 1970s was very much living in the shadow of the Cold War, and you can almost feel the tension between different ideas about the future. Is it utopia or dystopia? Science as salvation or science as destruction? Once again, I may be over-analysing this, but some pretty weighty issues put across to a young audience in a very engaging way, which I don't remember being patronising or seeking to lecture us. As well as Liz and Simon, there was a strong supporting cast of adult characters. There's Liz's father, Frank Skinner. No, not that one. played by Dennis Quilley, who's deeply involved in the mysteries surrounding the time barrier, and we were sometimes wondering which side of good or evil he was on. His presence brings a more mature emotional weight to the story. And of course, we can't forget the recurring villain, Commander Trainer, played by John Barron, later to become CJ in Reggie Perrin. He's the typical enigmatic government official who always seems to know a bit more than he lets on. He's that classic archetype of authority that you see quite a lot in these sci-fi series, who may or may not be trustworthy or on your side. Like so many of the shows we've covered on this podcast, Timeslip lives on because of a combination of great casting, good writing, and strong production. It takes a lot to make millions of viewers take the time barrier seriously, in spite of the very simple low-tech special effects. Though it was only on for one series, Timeslip left a lasting impression on its viewers. It may not have achieved the same level of mainstream success or recognition as Doctor Who, but it still has a devoted fan base to this day. And in the run-up to this podcast, when I was doing a bit of research, I've now joined the Timeslip Facebook community, where lots of people share their own memories of the show and the impact it had on them. Over the years, there have been the pan novelisations. Do you remember those? I had lots of the Doctor Who ones. There have been audio stories building on the original series. And in 2005, a DVD was released that brought the show to a new generation. What's fascinating, though, is how Timeslip tackled so many issues that remain relevant today. As we've mentioned, climate change, the ethics of science, and the impacts of technology. They're all things that we still talk about and still dominate our conversations. So in that sense, it feels like Timeslip was way ahead of its time, both as a piece of children's television and as a work of science fiction. As I said earlier, it hasn't been repeated since 1973 or maybe 1974. But if you'd like to see what all the fuss was about, or revisit the programme to see if the memories match, it's currently available on ITV's streaming service ITVX. Now that's the good news. The bad news is that even though all bar 2 of the original 26 episodes were made in colour, only black and white prints remain. In what seems to be a familiar story on this podcast, when Central Television took over the Midlands franchise from ATV in 1982, the original colour tapes were wiped to be reused and save money. After all, who would want to watch an old TV show in the future? Who indeed, eh? As we had a black and white TV set until 1977, it means I won't ever get to see Timeslip in all its Technicolor glory, but I am very tempted to watch it again and see whether it will still be as gripping, thought-provoking and menacing. I've had a quick look at the first few minutes of episode 1, and that, in itself, suggests I won't be disappointed. Timeslip is an important piece of TV history. It blends a fun, adventurous premise with some deep philosophical and moral questions that, as I've mentioned, still resonate with us today. I'd imagine its approach and style may seem a bit dated when I rewatch it, but the central storyline should be still effective. The low-budget special effects might feel dated, but like many shows of the period, I think that sometimes adds to the charm. And, of course, as a key show made in the 70s, it does feature lots of Nazis. Do you remember Timeslip? Am I being unfair on Simon remembering to be extremely irritating? Do let me know by leaving a comment on our blog at www.my70stvchildhood.com or on our Twitter/X, YouTube, Facebook or LinkedIn pages. Alternatively, you can drop me a line to oliver@my70stvchildhood.com. Well, that's all for now. Please keep your fingers crossed for us at the UK Independent Podcast Awards this week. Tell your friends all about us and join us again soon for more from My 70s TV Childhood.